Hey guys, so we're going to be talking about the road to the Civil War, 1850 to 1861. So the heated sectional controversy between the North and the South reaches new levels of intensity in the 1850s. Southerners and Northerners are growing more antagonistic as they debate the expansion of slavery into the West. At the end of the Mexican-American War, the United States had gained a large expanse of Western territory known as Mexican cession. This disposition of this new territory was in question. Would the new states be slave states or free soil states? In the long run, the Mexican-American War achieved what abolition alone had failed to do. It mobilized many in the North against slavery. So anti-slavery Northerners clung to the idea expressed in the 1846 Wilmot Proviso. Slavery could not be allowed to expand in the areas taken and later bought from Mexico. Though the proviso remained a proposal and never became a law, it defined the sectional division. So in one form or another, Wilmot's idea would frame the debate over the westward expansion of slavery for the next 15 years. Popular sovereignty appealed to many eager to protect states' rights because it seemed to be the most democratic solution over the debate of slavery. But it did not allow African Americans to vote for their debate. To vote for their fate. The issue of what to do with the Western territories added to the Republic by the Mexican cession consumed Congress in 1850. What you have, chief among them, is what to do about slaves. So, what you have is the Compromise of 1850. It's introduced by Henry Clay. Basically, it lots that California will enter the Union as a free state. Congress will pass the Fugitive Slave Act. Slavery in New Mexico and Utah territories would be determined by popular sovereignty, and the buying and selling of slaves would be outlawed in Washington, D.C. Henry Clay, he's a congressional veteran. He's offering these series of resolutions trying to address these issues and the expansion of slavery. His proposal ignites a spirited, angry debate that ends up lasting 8 months. The resolution calling for California to be admitted as a free state aroused the wrath of the aged and deathly ill John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Calhoun, too sick to deliver a speech, has his friend James Mason present his assessment of Clay's resolutions. In Calhoun's eyes, he blamed for this stalemate squarely on the North. Calhoun called for a vigorous federal law to ensure the runaway slaves would be returned to their masters. This is where you have this Fugitive Slave Act that comes into play. So, in the end, Clay stepped down as the leader of the compromise effort in frustration, and the Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas pushed 5 separate bills through Congress, collectively composing the Compromise of 1850. Now, ultimately, this compromise does fail, okay? They're choosing to believe it saves the Union, but rather than resolving division between the North and the South, the compromise just stands as a truce in an otherwise white-hot sectional conflict. Tensions in the nation remain extremely high. Southerners held several conventions about the compromise to discuss ways to protect the South. And the hope that the Compromise of 1850 would resolve the sectional crisis proved to be short-lived when the Fugitive Slave Act turned into a major source of conflict. See, the federal law imposed heavy fines and prison sentences on Northerners and Midwesterners who aided runaway slaves or refused to join posses to catch fugitives. So Northerners felt the law forced them to act as slave catchers against their will. The law also established a new group of federal commissioners who would decide the fate of fugitives brought before them. In some instances, slave catchers even brought in freed northern blacks, prompting abolitionist societies to step up their efforts to prevent kidnappings. So, The Fugitive Slave Act was the most controversial element of the Compromise of 1850. It really just strengthened the hand of slave catchers. It sought to recover slaves who had escaped months or even years beforehand and considered themselves safe. Now, during the 1850s, anti-slavery activists gained a powerful new weapon in the form of Harriet Beecher Stowe's best-selling novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she graphically described the horrors of slavery. See, during the 1830s and 40s, while raising 6 children in Cincinnati, Ohio, she helped runaway slaves who had crossed the Ohio River from Kentucky. So, by interviewing slaves and discussing with them their experiences in life, she writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, the actual number of runaway slaves who were not captured within a year of escaping remains very low, perhaps no more than 1,000 per year in the 1850s. Most stayed in the South, hiding in plain sight. Nonetheless, Southerners feared the influence of the vast Underground Railroad, the network of Northern whites and free blacks who sympathized with runaway slaves and provided safe houses and safe passage from the South. So it is unclear how many slaves actually escaped through the Underground Railroad, but historians believe somewhere between 50,000 to 100,000 slaves used the network in their bids for freedom. Harriet Tubman was one of the slaves who made their escape through the Underground Railroad and ends up distinguishing herself and becoming a captain among the Underground Railroad. She was born a slave in Maryland in 1822. Tubman, who had suffered greatly under slavery, found solace in Christianity and made her escape in the 1840s. She returned to the South more than a dozen times to lead other slaves, including her family and friends, along the Underground Railroad to freedom. Also during this time period, you have the Gadsden Purchase. We needed to complete the Transcontinental Railroad, and in order to do that, we purchased this piece of land here that's in purple from Mexico. We didn't start a war for it this time. We just bought it from Mexico so that we could complete connecting San Diego to Houston, Texas. The relative calm over the sectional issue is broken in 1854 over the issue of slavery in the territory of Kansas. Pressure had been building among Northerners to organize the territory west of Missouri and Iowa, which would have been admitted to the Union as a free state in 1846. Southerners, however, had opposed the Wilmot Proviso stipulation. So in the 1850s, many of the Southerners were growing resentful of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which established the 36th degree parallel as a geographical boundary of slavery on the north-south axis. So, what we have, Southerners are demanding more. They're trying to get away around the 1820 compromise with Missouri. So what we have is Douglas compiling, he wants to make a bill, right? So we have this territory of Kansas and Nebraska are created. It repeals the Missouri Compromise. And then he put forth that then the question of slavery would be decided through popular sovereignty. That is, they would be voting if they would like slavery or not. So, this move has major political consequences. The Democrats divide along sectional lines as a result of the bill, and the Whig Party, in the decline in the early 1850s, finds its political power slipping. More important, the KansasNebraska Act gives rise to the Republican Party as a new political party that attracted Northern Whigs, Democrats who shunned the KansasNebraska Act, members of the Free Soil Party, and assorted abolitionists. So, in the formation of the Republican Party, the Free Soil Party, and the Whig Party cease to exist. Now, this new Republican Party pledges itself to preventing the spread of slavery into the territories and rallied against the slave power, infuriating the South. As a result, the party becomes a solid Northern political organization. As never before, the U.S. political system was polarized along sectional fault lines. So the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act soon placed Kansas at the center of the increasingly violent debate over slavery. Nebraska would become a free state, but Kansas is up for grabs. So the residents of the Kansas Territory are perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way. So what ends up happening, outraged free state advocates in Kansas, now a majority, spur a bogus pro-slavery government and elect their own delegates to a constitutional convention that meets in Topeka in 1855. They applied for statehood and drafted a state constitution that excluded slavery. So what ends up happening is that there are now two competing governments claiming to rule Kansas Territory. So soon there is a territorial civil war to which journalists refer to as Bleeding Kansas. So these guys are flooding in and they begin settling into Kansas as pro or anti-slavery. Now, what ends up happening? In the spring of 1856, several of Lawrence, Kansas, leading anti-slavery citizens are indicted for treason. So there's a posse called, in which included Douglas County Sheriff Samuel Jones, to arrive outside of Lawrence, where they're going to arrest them. Now, the city takes on a non-violent non-resistance. Now, Jones decides that he's going to take over this posse. And he's going to burn down the town. So mobs burned down Lawrence, Kansas. And in a tit-for-tat situation, this is the sack of Lawrence, it ignites the passion of the abolitionist John Brown in this photo here. He's the son of a fervent Ohio Calvinist who taught his children that life was a crusade against sin. So the wickedest and those who were basically living in the most sin are those that owned and traded slaves, according to Brown. So Brown led 4 of his sons and a son-in-law down to Powhatan, Kansas, a pro-slavery settlement near the Missouri border. They dragged 5 men from their homes and hacked them to death with swords. They looted and burned homes. By the end of 1865, about 200 settlers had been killed in Bleeding, Kansas. Brown's actions pre-anticipated a new wave of violence, as told the guerrilla warfare between pro-slavery border ruffians and anti-slavery forces, which would continue and even escalate during the Civil War, resulted in over 150 deaths and significant property loss. So, the violence of Bleeding Kansas and what ends up happening in Congress even is you have the caning of Sumter in May of 1856, following a speech given by Sumter 2 days earlier in which he condemned slavery in no certain terms, declaring, admitting Kansas as a slave state is the rape of a virgin territory. He's criticizing pro-slavery legislators, particularly attacking a fellow senator and relative of Preston Brooks. So Brooks responds by beating Sumter over the head with his cane in the middle of Congress. Okay, this episode highlights the violent clash between pro and anti-slavery factions in the 1850s, a conflict that would eventually lead to the traumatic unveiling and unraveling of American democracy and civil war. So the election of 1856 took place in a transformed political landscape, all right? The Republicans are now on the stage. They're offering John C. Fremont as a candidate. James Buchanan is the pick for the Democrats, and he is elected, though Fremont does gather more than 33% of the popular vote. So I'm going to talk about Buchanan and the policies under him in the next video.